The calm after the storm was almost surreal. For weeks, Thomas had enjoyed the quiet peace he'd worked so hard to secure. The lakefront property, once again under his control, had become a sanctuary, a place to escape the chaos of the past. He spent mornings fishing from his dock, evenings watching sunsets reflect off the water, and weekends kayaking along the serene shores. His home, nestled along the edge of the lake, felt like the last place in the world where anyone could disrupt his peace. But despite the tranquility, something was starting to feel off. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first. A subtle shift in the air, perhaps. A strange tension he couldn't shake, even as his neighbors seemed to enjoy the newfound freedom of the lake. Thomas noticed how some of the old faces in the community, those who had once stayed out of the drama, now watched him with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Their smiles, though polite, no longer seemed quite as genuine. It wasn't long before rumors started to trickle in. Whispers in the grocery store, low conversations at the local park. Neighbors who once stood firmly behind him were now expressing their discomfort. They spoke of a shift in leadership in the HOA, a new president who had big plans for the neighborhood, plans that didn't sit well with anyone who valued their personal freedoms. Thomas had hoped the HOA was done with him. They had backed off after their embarrassing defeat, and for a moment, he believed that the battle was over. But it seemed that was far from the case. The new HOA president, Cynthia Carter, was a name that quickly became synonymous with strict rules and tight control. From what Thomas heard, she was even more determined than the last regime to enforce regulations that no one had ever voted for. The first signs of trouble appeared when a few of his neighbors approached him at the corner coffee shop, their faces drawn with worry. "Have you heard what Cynthia wants to do now?" one of them, Dave, asked. Dave had always been the sort to keep his head down, avoiding confrontation. Seeing him this rattled made Thomas uneasy. "No," Thomas replied, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "What's going on?" "They're talking about adding more rules," Dave said in a hushed voice. "Tighter restrictions on lake access. She wants to build a boardwalk along the shoreline, add parking lots, and, well, the word is, they're planning to fence off certain areas again, like the whole stretch of water's under their control now." Thomas felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He had fought so hard for the freedom he'd won, only to hear now that it might be slipping away again. The very idea of them controlling the lake, of them turning it into some corporate-like project, filled him with a deep sense of dread. Cynthia's plans didn't align with what the neighborhood wanted, but she was powerful now, surrounded by allies who seemed eager to push forward with her vision, regardless of how the community felt. The more he listened, the more he realized that Cynthia's push wasn't just about controlling the lake. She had bigger dreams for the whole neighborhood, a gated, highly regulated community. Thomas could feel the creeping tension in the air, something that had always been just beneath the surface of suburban life, now bubbling to the forefront. This wasn't about improving the community anymore. It was about power, about asserting dominance. One evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the lake, he saw more signs of the change. A group of HOA members stood at the park across the street, talking in low voices, glancing his way as they huddled together, clipboard in hand. The subtle shift he had sensed earlier was no longer in the background. It was front and center, now impossible to ignore. But what truly unsettled him was the feeling that this time, the HOA wasn't going to back down so easily. Cynthia Carter wasn't like the previous president. She was strategic, calculating, and ready to do whatever it took to push through her agenda, no matter the cost. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the familiar gnawing sense of danger rising within him. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Thomas had always prided himself on knowing the pulse of his neighborhood, the ebb and flow of its quiet rhythms. But lately, the peace he'd fought so hard for was beginning to feel more like a fragile veneer, barely holding together under the weight of new, unseen forces. Just when he thought the HOA's grip had loosened for good, a new figure emerged in the drama. Someone he never expected to be part of the equation. Steve Matthews had lived 2 doors down for years. A quiet, seemingly unassuming man, Steve was the kind of neighbor who would wave hello on his morning jog or chat about the weather while picking up his mail. He wasn't involved in the community much, preferring the solitude of his modest home, much like Thomas did. So, when Thomas saw Steve at the local coffee shop one morning, wearing a crisp shirt and a determined expression, it caught him off guard. "Good morning, Thomas." Steve greeted him with a warm smile, sitting down across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Got a minute? I need to talk to you about something." Thomas raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "I've been thinking," Steve began, his tone casual but sincere. "The HOA needs some new blood. We've got a lot of changes coming, and I think I could help make things a bit more equitable for everyone." Thomas set his coffee cup down slowly, his instincts immediately picking up on something beneath Steve's calm demeanor. He had no idea that Steve had been thinking about getting involved in the HOA, let alone taking on such a leadership role. "What kind of changes?" Thomas asked, leaning back in his chair, studying Steve carefully. Something about the way Steve was speaking, the way his words seemed almost rehearsed, raised a red flag. "Well, you know, Cynthia is making some great moves with the boardwalk and parking areas," Steve continued. "But there's more we can do. We need to improve access to the lake for everyone, and I think it's time we made it a more community-friendly environment. That means open spaces, more parking, maybe even a few designated recreational areas." Thomas's pulse quickened. There it was again, the lake access talk. After everything he'd fought for, the idea that the HOA was once again considering tightening their grip on the one thing that had been his sanctuary felt like a punch to the gut. "Sounds like you're agreeing with Cynthia on a lot of this," Thomas said, his voice laced with suspicion. "Maybe too much." Steve's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I just think the community could benefit from more structure. People want change, Thomas. They're not all happy with how things have been." Thomas considered Steve for a long moment, his mind spinning. He had always thought of Steve as a harmless, friendly neighbor. But now, Steve seemed to be aligning with Cynthia more than was reasonable. It didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just about the lake, it was about control. And as far as Thomas was concerned, that was the one thing the HOA couldn't have. "Look, Steve," Thomas said slowly, his voice measured. "I know what Cynthia wants. And I fought for this land, for the right to access the lake without restrictions. I'm not about to let that go without a fight." Steve's expression softened, but there was an edge to his words now. "I get it. I really do. But things change. Thomas, the HOA is a force in this neighborhood, and sometimes we have to compromise for the greater good." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, but there was something about Steve's words now that sounded almost rehearsed, too calculated, too perfect. As the conversation wrapped up, Steve left with a few vague assurances, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no way Steve had just suddenly become interested in the HOA after all these years. There had to be more to it. A connection, perhaps. Something deeper that tied him to Cynthia. Later that evening, Thomas decided to do some digging. He scoured old HOA meeting minutes, cross-referencing names and dates. That's when he found it. Steve Matthews had been a close associate of Cynthia's for years. They had attended community functions together, their names frequently appearing in the same circles long before Steve's sudden interest in the HOA. And then, buried in the minutes from a meeting 6 months ago, Thomas found a note that made His blood run cold. Steve had privately endorsed Cynthia for the position of HOA president. It all clicked. Steve wasn't just a friendly neighbor trying to help. He was part of Cynthia's inner circle, an extension of her power, quietly working to secure her control over the neighborhood once again. His apparent concern for the community was just another play in their game. The realization hit Thomas hard. Steve wasn't the ally he appeared to be. He was another pawn in Cynthia's plan to push through her vision of the neighborhood, one where Thomas and the other homeowners were at the mercy of the HOA's whims. The next time Thomas saw Steve, it was at a neighborhood BBQ. Steve approached him casually, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Thomas wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. "Steve," Thomas said, his voice low, "I've been looking into things and I'm starting to see the bigger picture. You're not just here to help the community, are you?" Steve's smile tightened, and for a split second, Thomas saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark, something that confirmed his suspicions. "I'm just doing what I think is best," Steve replied, his voice smooth, but with an edge that Thomas could feel. Sometimes, the greater good requires a little push. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Thomas understood. This wasn't just a battle against the HOA. This was personal, and it was a war he wasn't about to lose. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee forgotten in front of him. The early morning sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the stack of papers spread out before him. He had spent the better part of the night scouring through the new set of HOA documents he'd acquired, meeting minutes, zoning plans, property maps, and the deeper he dug, the more his stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. For weeks now, he'd felt the quiet tension in the neighborhood, like the air before a storm. His neighbors had been acting distant, more reserved, and even the air at the HOA meetings had shifted, no longer full of open debate but heavy with an undercurrent of calculated decisions. It wasn't just Steve anymore. The entire HOA seemed to be preparing for something bigger than he'd anticipated. As Thomas flipped through a series of zoning maps, a detail on one caught his eye. A section of land, adjacent to his property, had been marked for future community development. The dotted line that separated his property from this land was the same line that had once defined his lakefront access, the same line the HOA had tried to control with the fence. But now, the boundary had shifted. It was as if someone had quietly redefined the very edge of his rights, and they were planning to encroach further. His hand tightened around the papers, his pulse quickening. The HOA wasn't just meddling with the lake access. They were aiming to expand the fence, to take control of the entire lakefront. But this time, it wasn't just a simple overreach. They had found a way to justify it, using legal loopholes and ambiguous property claims that seemed airtight on paper. Thomas could already feel the weight of the battle ahead pressing down on him. The stakes were higher now, and they weren't just pushing him out. They were planning to erase everything he'd fought for. But what shocked him more was the name that kept appearing in the documents: Steve Matthews. There, in black and white, Steve's name was linked to a series of meetings with Cynthia Carter, the HOA president. It wasn't just a few casual conversations. These were private, closed-door meetings where they discussed long-term goals for neighborhood development, which, as Thomas read between the lines, meant taking over more property, his property. His heart sank as he scanned further, realizing that the plan was already in motion. Cynthia and Steve were not only behind the expansion of the fence, but had already started purchasing neighboring properties under the guise of neighborhood enhancement. There was a clear strategy at play, one that involved quietly manipulating bylaws to shift property lines, bypassing normal procedures to gain control of key areas that they knew would eventually be worth something. Thomas felt a sickening sense of betrayal. Steve had been playing both sides from the start, and now it was clear he was no friend. He was a key player in a game designed to take away what Thomas had worked so hard to protect. The most insidious part of it all, however, was the manipulation of the bylaws. Cynthia had managed to slip a clause into the most recent meeting that allowed for the HOA to reclaim certain sections of property under the guise of community beautification and improving common spaces. The timing couldn't have been more convenient. It would have passed unnoticed by most people, but Thomas knew it for what it was, a calculated move to bypass any objections from homeowners and bypass legal challenges. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the papers still in his hands. His mind raced. He could already imagine the future fights, the long meetings, the legal paperwork. It was happening again, and this time they had the upper hand. They had planned everything meticulously, using the very rules he had fought to keep intact. They knew where the loopholes were, and they weren't afraid to use them. What had begun as a fight to protect his own rights now felt like a battle to save the integrity of his home, his life. This wasn't just about a lake or a fence anymore. It was about the control of his property, and worse, the erosion of his freedom. The stakes had been raised, and he could no longer afford to sit back and wait for things to unfold. He needed to act, but this time he knew he'd have to play their game. He'd have to fight fire with fire, expose the manipulation, challenge the bylaws, and find a way to turn their carefully laid plans against them. But Thomas was no longer just defending his home. He was now fighting for something far larger. The right to live without being controlled. The right to keep the peace they'd fought so hard to build. As the realization hit him, the weight of what was to come settled, like a heavy stone in his chest. He had won before, but now he'd have to win again. Only this time, the battle would require every ounce of strategy and cunning he had, and he wasn't sure yet if that would be enough. The moment Thomas realized he was facing something far more sinister than a few HOA bylaws being misused, he knew he couldn't rely on his instincts alone anymore. This wasn't just about protecting his land. It was about unraveling a web of deceit that stretched far beyond the lake's edge. The HOA had learned from their past mistakes. They weren't going to make the same errors that had led to their defeat. This time, they were playing a smarter game. But Thomas was no stranger to battles. He just needed the right tools. The first step, he decided, was to go back to basics. He spent hours combing through property records and zoning laws, the flickering light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the piles of paperwork that now filled his home. Every page he turned felt like a step closer to uncovering the truth. He knew the HOA had exploited legal loopholes before, but now it seemed they had gone one step further. The more Thomas dug into the bylaws, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just quietly trying to control the lakefront. They were setting the stage to rezone several properties around it, including his, without anyone noticing. But it wasn't just about the legal documents. Thomas knew that something deeper was at play, something more hidden. So, he decided to visit the local government office, the one place where all the HOA's official communications had to be filed. He needed to see what Cynthia and Steve had been up to behind closed doors. As he walked into the cold, sterile building, the silence was thick with bureaucracy. He approached the records desk, greeted by a clerk who had seen his face many times before. "Can I help you, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, her voice flat. "I need to look into the HOA's recent meetings and any property rezoning requests," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. He had practiced this moment in his head, rehearsing how to ask the right questions without raising suspicions. The clerk nodded and disappeared into the back room, returning with a stack of papers that Thomas quickly rifled through. His heart skipped a beat when he found what he was looking for, meeting notes that were marked as confidential. The more he read, the angrier he became. There, in the footnotes of a public meeting minutes document, he found a reference to private negotiations and future property acquisitions. They were planning to purchase several lots adjacent to his property to consolidate their control over the entire lakefront. He wasn't wrong to feel the tension rising within him. The documents were damning, but they weren't enough on their own. He needed more. As the days passed, Thomas continued to dig, following every lead he could find. He reached out to old neighbors, people who had been part of the community for years but were too intimidated to speak out. One of them, a woman named Carla, had lived in the neighborhood long before Thomas moved in. Her voice trembled on the phone, but she was willing to meet him in person. They sat at a small diner on the edge of town, surrounded by the hum of muted conversations. "They've been threatening people," Carla whispered, looking over her shoulder nervously. "If anyone complains about Cynthia's plans, they make it hard for them to sell their homes or raise the dues on their property. They don't care if it's legal. They just make life miserable." Thomas listened intently, his fingers tapping the edge of his coffee cup as he absorbed her words. It was exactly what he'd feared. The HOA wasn't just pushing for control of the lake. They were using fear, coercion, and intimidation to maintain their grip on the community. But what struck him the most was Carla's next revelation. "I overheard Steve talking to Cynthia last month," she said, her voice dropping lower. "He said something about sweeping changes and solidifying their power. He didn't say much, but the way he said it, Thomas, it was like they were in it together. This wasn't about helping the community. This was about controlling it." The words hit Thomas like a slap. Steve, the same man who had come across as a harmless neighbor, was deep in this conspiracy, working hand in hand with Cynthia. And he wasn't just supporting her plans, he was orchestrating them. The more he connected the dots, the clearer it became that Steve had been the mastermind behind the latest developments. He had carefully maneuvered himself into the HOA's leadership, aligning himself with Cynthia's agenda, all while pretending to be the friendly neighbor. Every conversation, every document, every underhanded tactic started to reveal itself as part of a grander scheme, a plot that had been unfolding for months. With newfound resolve, Thomas knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this go any further. He had the evidence, the witnesses, and now, the knowledge of what Cynthia and Steve had been hiding. The stakes were higher than ever, but Thomas wasn't going to let them bulldoze his home, his life, or the peace he'd fought so hard to protect. As he left the diner, the weight of the battle ahead settled in. He knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He would confront the HOA, expose their lies, and take back control. The fight was far from over, and this time, he was going to make sure the truth came to light. Thomas sat in his car outside the HOA office, the stack of documents in the passenger seat beside him. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He had waited for this moment for weeks, months even, and now that it was finally here, he couldn't afford to falter. The weight of the battle ahead felt heavy, but it wasn't the first time he had fought for what was his. This time, though, the stakes were higher. He could see the building ahead of him, the place that had become a symbol of everything he despised. The HOA was no longer just a small nuisance. It had become an unstoppable force, threatening everything he had worked for. And Steve, the once friendly neighbor, now seemed like the perfect puppet for the new president's manipulative schemes. He'd allowed himself to believe that Steve was just a pawn in all this, but he'd been wrong. Steve had been in on it from the start. As Thomas walked into the office, the usual sterile scent of paper and coffee hit his nostrils. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, but her eyes were wary. She knew something was different about him today. He wasn't here to negotiate or compromise. Today, he was here to expose the truth. He was escorted into a conference room where Steve and Cynthia sat waiting, their expressions unreadable. The air between them was thick with tension. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he pushed the nerves aside. He couldn't afford to show any weakness now. "Thomas," Steve said, his voice smooth, almost too calm, "it's good to see you. I trust you've been enjoying your peaceful lake access." Thomas sat down across from them, his eyes narrowing. as he locked gazes with Steve. The warmth in Steve's voice couldn't disguise the underlying arrogance. Thomas knew this meeting wasn't going to be civil. It was the moment of reckoning. "I've been looking into your little plans," Thomas began, his voice steady, but with an edge that cut through the room. "And it looks like you've been a little too eager to take control of things you don't own." Cynthia's eyes flickered with a mix of amusement and irritation. She folded her arms across her chest, leaning back in her chair. "You've always been a troublemaker, Thomas," she said coolly. "We're just trying to make the community better. You should understand that." "Better?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising. "You're not trying to make anything better. You're using your position to manipulate the rules, take over people's property, and control the lake for your own gain." Steve's calm expression remained unchanged, but Thomas could see the tension in his jaw. The smile he had once used so often to charm the neighbors now seemed forced, like a mask that could no longer hide the truth. "I don't know what you think you know, Thomas," Steve said slowly, his voice lower now, tinged with something darker. "But I suggest you drop it, for your own sake." Thomas placed the stack of documents in front of him, the papers crackling as they slid across the table. "This says otherwise," he said, pushing the pile toward them. "I've got everything. Meeting minutes, property records, everything." "That proves what you've been up to." Cynthia's face hardened. "You think you can scare us with paperwork?" She sneered. "We've got the law on our side, Thomas, and we've got the whole community behind us. You're just one man, and you're not going to stop us." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're wrong," he said, quietly. "This is my home, and I'll fight you for it every step of the way." The room was silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Thomas could feel his pulse racing, but he stood firm. He wasn't backing down, not this time. Then Steve finally spoke, his voice dropping to a low, almost threatening tone. "You're making a mistake, Thomas. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Cynthia and I don't just hold power in this neighborhood. We've got influence. You start stirring things up, and there will be consequences you won't like." Thomas's breath hitched slightly, but he didn't flinch. "Is that supposed to intimidate me?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with determination. "You're not going to scare me off. Not this time. You can try all the tricks you want, but I won't back down." The silence in the room grew, heavier, each second stretching longer. Cynthia's smile faltered, her facade cracking for just a moment. She clearly hadn't expected Thomas to stand his ground, not after everything they'd already done to bend people to their will. But Thomas could see the fear behind her eyes now. This wasn't just a negotiation anymore. It was a battle. And, for the first time since all of this started, he could see that he wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Steve stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He shot Thomas a venomous look before turning to Cynthia. "We're done here," he said, voice full of barely contained anger. "This isn't over, Thomas." As they both stood to leave, Thomas's heart raced. He had just taken the first step in a much bigger fight, but he knew the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the door slammed behind them, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and adrenaline. They had threatened him, tried to intimidate him, but he had stood his ground. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The weeks following his confrontation with Steve and Cynthia had left Thomas drained, but also determined. He had no intention of fighting this battle alone. If the HOA had learned anything from their past moves, it was that they thrived when they could. Divide and conquer. But Thomas wasn't going to let them turn his community into their battleground. He knew that to stand a chance, he needed to rally his neighbors. The people who had been quietly watching from the sidelines now needed to become active participants in this fight. It wasn't easy at first. Many of his neighbors had kept their heads down, afraid of the HOA's overreach and the consequences of defying Cynthia, the new president. Some were too scared of retaliation to speak out, while others were simply resigned to the idea that the HOA held too much power to challenge. But Thomas had learned over the years that when people felt they had nothing left to lose, they were capable of incredible things. And he had seen the cracks in the HOA's carefully constructed facade, cracks that were widening as more people began to question the board's actions. He started small, talking to a few trusted neighbors, those who had once quietly supported his stance during the lake access dispute. People like Jennifer, a retired teacher, and Tom, a single father who had lived on the block for years. Both of them had their own reasons to despise the HOA's overreach. Jennifer had been hit with constant fines for trivial violations, and Tom's shed had been flagged for non-compliance with some arbitrary rule. They were fed up. As they met, in Thomas's living room, discussing their options, he realized just how many shared stories of HOA manipulation were out there. The more he listened, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just an annoyance, they were a tyrannical force in the neighborhood, using fear and intimidation to control everyone. But the tide was turning. Jennifer suggested they use the next public HOA meeting as a platform to air their grievances. "It's time to make some noise," she said, her hands shaking with both excitement and apprehension. "The public needs to know what they've been doing behind closed doors." The idea clicked. Thomas knew that one loud voice wasn't going to cut it, but a chorus of voices could expose the HOA for what it really was. They'd take this fight to the community. They'd force the HOA into the light. They started organizing. Word spread quickly as neighbors began to rally together. Some, like Karen and Greg from down the street, had been intimidated by the HOA for years, but had never had the courage to stand up. But now, with Thomas leading the charge, they found their voices. The group created a petition, gathered evidence, and planned for the upcoming meeting. They weren't just going to show up, they were going to take control of the conversation. They would bring the truth to the forefront, even if it meant risking everything. The tension among the community was palpable. Some were nervous, unsure of the fallout, while others were ready for a showdown. But as the meeting date neared, the support grew stronger. Thomas could feel the shift in the air. The momentum was building. On the night of the meeting, the usually quiet room was packed. Thomas stood at the back, watching as neighbors filtered in, many of them with grim but determined faces. A few of them had even brought legal counsel with them, prepared for whatever the HOA might throw their way. They had become a united front, no longer divided by fear or indifference. But as the meeting began, Thomas noticed something unexpected. A familiar face appeared in the crowd. Tina, a longtime member of the HOA board, who had once been a loyal ally of Cynthia. She had always been one of the more vocal supporters of the president's policies, often defending her decisions without hesitation. But tonight, Tina looked uneasy. She avoided making eye contact with Cynthia, her shoulders tense as she sat among the other board members. It wasn't until after the meeting had started that Thomas received an unexpected text. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, and when he checked it, his heart skipped a beat. Tina had sent him a message. "Meet me after the meeting. I have something you need to see." Thomas's pulse quickened. He had no idea what Tina's change of heart meant, but it didn't matter. This was the break he'd been hoping for. Without a word to anyone, he slipped out of the meeting room, his mind racing. Tina was waiting for him in the parking lot, standing near her car with a file tucked under her arm. Her eyes darted nervously as Thomas approached. She looked over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching before handing him the file. This is what you need," Tina whispered, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't live with myself anymore. The HOA's been manipulating the property lines, falsifying documents. And Cynthia, she's been making secret deals with developers for years. It's all in here." Thomas opened the file carefully, his hands trembling as he flipped through pages of documents, contracts, and emails. everything he needed to bring down the HOA's corruption. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "Thank you." Tina's eyes filled with regret. "I was wrong to support her," she said, her voice breaking. "But it's not too late. You can stop this. Please, take them down. For everyone." As Thomas walked back to his car, the weight of the evidence in his hands felt like a new kind of power. This battle wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone in the community who had suffered under the HOA's reign. And now, with the support of his neighbors and this critical piece of evidence, he finally had the upper hand. The fight wasn't over, but the tides had definitely shifted in his favor. The courtroom was suffocating. The tension hung in the air, like a thick fog, settling over everyone in the room. Thomas, his attorney, the handful of loyal supporters from the neighborhood, and the forceful representatives of the HOA, including Steve and Cynthia, both of whom were dressed impeccably, their faces set in grim determination. The last several months had been a slow, calculated build-up to this point, a legal showdown that would determine the future of the community. Thomas knew the stakes were higher than ever. The HOA had been relentless, playing every dirty trick they could think of, and this battle in court was their final attempt to regain control. Thomas, dressed in a crisp suit that felt too tight around his chest, sat beside his attorney, Angela, a seasoned lawyer whose reputation for going head-to-head with powerful corporations and organizations had earned her both respect and enemies. She had been a fierce ally, helping him navigate the complex world of legal jargon and strategy. She gave him a reassuring smile, but even she couldn't mask the gravity of the situation. The courtroom was packed with people, many from the neighborhood who had rallied behind Thomas, but also a handful of HOA members and their hired legal team. The opposing counsel was well-versed in underhanded tactics, and they didn't hesitate to throw around threats, maneuvering the proceedings with practiced ease. As the judge called the session to order, Thomas felt a bead of sweat slide down his temple. His hands were cold, his heart pounding in his chest, but he steeled himself. This wasn't just about the lake access anymore. This was about taking back the control that had been stolen from him, his neighbors, and the entire community. The proceedings began, and the HOA wasted no time. Their first witness, a local developer, took the stand. He spoke with smooth conviction, painting a picture of the HOA's benevolent oversight, claiming that the association's actions were in the best interest of the community. He spoke about future plans to improve the neighborhood, plans that included expanded control over private properties, stricter rules on land use, and of course, more fences. The jury seemed to buy it, nodding along with the developer's polished rhetoric. Thomas listened intently, but his eyes never wavered from the HOA's legal team. They seemed too confident, too smug. He knew their tactics, sly, manipulative, and often based on half-truths and outright lies. They'd thrown everything at him in the past, false accusations, threats, and underhanded tactics. But this time, it was different. He had the evidence, and the community was behind him. He wasn't going to back down. Angela rose to make her case. The room fell silent as she began speaking. Her words were calm, measured, but they carried the weight of the truth. "Your Honor," she began, addressing the judge with respect, "the HOA, under the leadership of Cynthia and Steve, has systematically abused its power to control and intimidate homeowners. The documents we've provided, the testimonies you've heard, show a clear pattern of corruption. They've violated their own bylaws, manipulated property lines, and misled their community. This is not a case of improving the neighborhood. This is a case of greed and power-hungry individuals using their position for personal gain." Thomas's pulse quickened as the tension in the room built. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors who had gathered, watching this critical moment unfold. He knew that they had invested everything in this fight. They had placed their faith in him, and now it was his turn to deliver. The judge asked for A brief recess, and during that time, Thomas walked to the back of the courtroom, trying to calm his nerves. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA was hiding something, a piece of the puzzle that had yet to be revealed. His suspicions grew as he saw Steve whispering urgently to Cynthia. The two of them exchanged a look that made his stomach churn. They were up to something. When the trial resumed, Thomas's attorney continued to dismantle the HOA's case. But just as the judge seemed ready to rule in their favor, a surprise witness entered the courtroom, someone Thomas never expected. It was Tina. She stepped into the witness box, her face flushed with anxiety. The room went silent as everyone turned to look at her. She was the last person anyone expected to help Thomas. A former loyal supporter of Cynthia, Tina had been one of the HOA board members who had stood by their decisions, helping them implement their draconian rules. But today, she looked different. She looked scared. "I'm here to tell the truth," Tina said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I've seen the records. I've witnessed the backroom deals. The HOA's actions were never about improving the community. They've been planning to expand their control, to manipulate property rights for their own profit. I know they're behind the illegal expansion of property lines, and they've been using their influence to get developers to buy land at undervalued prices to make a profit. They lied, they manipulated, and they used their power to intimidate anyone who dared to speak up." Thomas's heart soared. He had known Tina was conflicted, but hearing her testimony, seeing the courage it took for her to stand there, against everything she had once believed in, was a moment of vindication. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. The jury was silent, absorbing every word Tina said. The room was tense as she continued. "I'm afraid of what might happen next, but I can't let them continue to control the neighborhood. I'm sorry for the role I played in this, but I can't stay silent any longer." The mood in the courtroom shifted. The once confident faces of the HOA board now looked strained, their smugness replaced by nervous glances. The evidence was overwhelming. Tina's testimony was the final piece that exposed their manipulation. The judge didn't need much more to make his decision. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. The HOA's actions were not only illegal but also unethical. The case is dismissed, and their authority over the property is hereby nullified. The community is free to govern itself. The room erupted in applause. The HOA's reign had ended, and the community's fight was over. Thomas looked at Tina, who gave him a small, shaky smile. She had done it. She had helped them win. The victory wasn't just legal. It was a triumph of community, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right. The HOA had lost, but the people had won. And the lake, once again, was theirs. The courtroom was finally quiet, the air still with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, the judge's gavel struck down hard on the sound block. A weight seemed to lift off Thomas's shoulders as he heard the words he had longed to hear. "In favor of the community," the judge stated, his voice firm and resolute. "The HOA's actions have been ruled invalid. The lakefront property is recognized as part of the community, with fair and equal access for all residents." Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was over. He had won, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood that had been caught in the crossfire of the HOA's manipulative overreach. The years of struggle, sleepless nights, and relentless legal battles had culminated in this moment of justice. The power that had once been wielded so cruelly by Cynthia and her associates had crumbled, and now the lake, the heart of the community, was finally open to everyone once again. As the courtroom emptied and people poured into the hallway, a small crowd gathered around Thomas. Neighbors, friends, and even a few hesitant supporters who had once feared speaking out now stood by him, patting him on the back and shaking his hand. The sense of camaraderie, of unity, was overwhelming. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a victory for the spirit of the community itself. The bonds that had been tested and strained over the past few months had finally been mended, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the weight of the past few years lift from his shoulders. But there was still something else. Thomas could feel a shift in the energy around him. The neighborhood had won, yes, but there were still some truths yet to be revealed. As the final pieces of the case unfolded, it was clear that Steve, the seemingly friendly neighbor who had worked so closely with Cynthia and the HOA, had been playing a much deeper game all along. He hadn't just been a pawn in the HOA's scheming, he had been a key player, and his actions were far more sinister than anyone had realized. Through the final investigation, connections between Steve and the previous HOA president had been uncovered. It wasn't just about controlling the lakefront property, it was about manipulating the neighborhood for personal gain. Steve had used his position as a neighborly ally to work his way into the trust of the community, all while secretly orchestrating a plan to push through changes that would benefit him and his associates financially. It wasn't just the HOA that was corrupt. It was Steve's covert involvement that had allowed the entire scheme to go undetected for so long. The truth came out during the final stages of the court case, when Tina, the former HOA board member, who had turned against them, gave her testimony. She revealed that Steve had been feeding information to the previous HOA president and working behind the scenes to manipulate property values in favor of developers who had connections to him. The web of lies and deceit began to unravel, and it became clear that Steve was no longer the harmless neighbor he had once appeared to be. He had been exploiting the situation for his own advantage, using his influence to undermine the community at every turn. In the aftermath of the court's decision, the HOA's corruption was laid bare for all to see. Steve's ties to the previous president were fully exposed, and the community was left in disbelief at how they had been so easily manipulated. The shockwaves of betrayal rippled through the neighborhood, but justice had been served. Steve was ousted from the community, and his connections were severed. His reputation, once untouchable, was now forever tarnished. As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal. The lake, which had once been a symbol of division and tension, became a place of peace and unity once more. The dock was filled with families, children running along the shore, and kayakers gliding across the water. Thomas watched from his porch, his heart swelling with pride. He had fought for this, for the peaceful, harmonious community he knew was possible. And now, it was a reality. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas walked down to the lake. The cool breeze ruffled the water, creating small ripples that danced across the surface. He sat down on the dock, feeling the weight of the battle finally lift from his chest. There was no more fighting left to do. The peace he had fought so hard for was finally his, and it was here to stay. As he sat there, the world seemed to slow around him. The sounds of laughter from his neighbors drifted over, and he could hear the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. It was a sound he had missed, the sound of serenity, of community. For the first time in a long while, Thomas allowed himself to truly relax. The fight was over. The peace had been restored, and as the sun set over the lake, Thomas took a quiet moment to reflect. This time, the battle was truly over. The lake was open again, the community was whole, and the future was bright. The fight had been long and hard, but in the end, it was worth it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.